Hey everyone, welcome to another episode of Great Leadership. My guest today is Amy Salcido, the president of Kyndryl in the United States. Amy, thank you for joining me.
Thank you so much for having me, Jacob.
So for people who are not familiar with Kyndryl, why don't we start there? Give us a little bit of background information about the company, and then we can talk a little bit about your background and how you got into this role.
Yeah, sure. So look, Kyndryl, it may not be a name that everyone knows yet, but hopefully it's one that people will remember after this. So Kyndryl is actually the world's largest provider of IT infrastructure services to corporations across the world. So it was born out of a spinoff. So that is a little bit of a unique nuance that, not everyone gets to experience in their career, but I've been grateful for this opportunity. I was a longtime IBMer, so worked at IBM for a lot of my career. 3 years ago, almost exactly like this week, IBM announced the intent to spin off a part of the corporation, about 25% of the company. And, I elected to go for the ride on that adventure. And we've been independent for just shy of 2 years now. So our anniversary is coming up on November 4th. And so it's been a tremendous opportunity to kind of get to be part of something new. And while the name may not be known again to a lot of people, I think the work that we do and the customers we do it for, which is keeping planes in skies and keeping banks transacting money and keeping hospitals taking care of patients.
All important things.
It's all things. Yeah, exactly. It's things that people use and see every day, even if they don't know that we're behind it.
Yeah.
So.
And how many employees do you guys have actually?
Yeah, so globally we have about 90,000
Wow.
employees running the US business. Yeah, so it's not a small company. And even just for the US business, I have about 16,000 people as part of my organization.
That's crazy.
So.
So you're a massive company, and were all these people originally a part of IBM before?
I would say the majority. So when we brought over, a large group of people, I would say 90,000 people, but we've had a lot of change since
Okay.
then. We've brought in a lot of new people. So I've been really excited to see the people from the IT industry and particularly from the IT consulting industry who've wanted to come along for
Yeah.
this journey as well. And so we've attracted a lot of new talent over the last 2 years, which for me is an exciting sign because you don't know exactly what's going to happen when you
Yeah.
start an adventure like this.
Yeah. So obviously you spent a lot of your career at IBM. And I think back in the day, a lot of people used to turn to IBM and they said that they were sort of the hallmark of leadership training and development. And IBM was, thought of as this big pillar in the business world. And some people still consider IBM to be that pillar in the business world. But having spent so much of your time there, what did you learn from working at that organization in terms of leadership lessons, career advice, anything that you picked up during your time there?
Yeah, sure. I mean, as you said, I did spend a number of years there, and look, I feel really fortunate that I had the ability to take part in a lot of our leadership development programs, and I had a lot of really great mentors, and those were probably the things that were the best teachers for me was those mentoring relationships, that and actual roles. Like, I can think of one role in particular that was, I was leading an account, a customer account, and that was a great teacher for the highs and the lows. There's nothing more humbling than being in front of a client every day. So that's its own kind of teacher. But just from a leadership and career development standpoint, I would say it was really the mentors that I had the opportunity to work with, and that for me was a big lesson
Yeah.
because I think back to my first sort of very senior executive mentor that I had, and who today is no longer with IBM. He's a CEO at a different company, but that just sort of tells you the kind of person this was and
Are
the
you able to share
trajectory
who
he
it
was
is,
on.
or is that like top secret?
Uh, it's not top secret. Mark Lautenbach is who that was, who left IBM to become CEO at Pitney Bowes, and just a fantastic guy all around and a great leader. And he definitely challenged me. I remember, one of my first conversations with him, and um, he asked me what I wanted to get out of it. And I had like the lamest answer ever. So, I just gave the basic, like, oh, career advice. Um, and, many years on, I would not say that now, but
Yeah,
and he kind of politely said, "Okay, that's a given. Like, now let's talk about what you really wanted to get out of this. Like, what are you looking for? Where do you feel like you need help? Where do you feel like maybe you have things you need to work on and things you need to navigate maybe in the organization?"
yeah,
And so he really just challenged me to think of the role of the mentee. We often think of the role of the mentor
yeah.
and not as much of the role of the mentee. And I do a lot today at Kyndryl around diversity and inclusion, and we have a number of cohorts that are really to develop. I have a women's cohort, I have a person of color cohort, I have a number of them, and it's really to make sure we're accelerating people. And a part of it is the mentors. We assign them all mentors, and I'm always really clear that that part of it is their responsibility, right? I mean, yes, the mentor has to be available and they have to participate in a thoughtful way, but don't expect the mentor to drive everything for you, right? Like you've got to show up, you've got to make the calls, you've got to do your homework in between. You got to be curious and ask good questions, and you've got to think about what you want to get out of it. And I think that is a lasting lesson that I will always take with me, that I first learned when I was at IBM, but now I try to impart on the people within my organization, because I just think that that's a part of mentoring that probably doesn't get talked about often enough, is really the role of the mentee. And it's not just you sort of reach out to a lot of people and you schedule time with them, and you have to be thoughtful about it. What are the things you're trying to accomplish and would like some help with, and think a mentor could be valuable for.
I'd love to talk a little bit more about that, because one of the things that I always tell people is that, especially if you're a new employee and you're trying to take a job for a company, is to pay more attention focusing on the leader that you're going to be working with, as opposed to the brand of the company or the culture or the money. Like, who you're
Mm,
actually going to be working with, I think makes the most difference. And so in your
mm.
case, when you were working with him, what role did you have as far as, kind of the role in the company, and what role did he have? Was he like an EVP at the time and you were reporting to him?
No, I wasn't. He wasn't in my reporting structure. And I'll say, as a side note, I think that is another important piece of having a mentor. Often, especially in a large corporation, is to have somebody who is outside of your reporting chain, so that
Ah,
they can give you more unbiased
yeah, yeah.
advice and counsel. I mean, I always look at it and I tell people, hey, like, people in my reporting chain, you have me. I'm part of your reporting chain. That's a given. Now I need to find you someone
Hmm.
outside of that to really help you and be a place that you feel safe and you can have a sounding board, and it doesn't feel like you're talking to your boss's boss's
Yeah,
boss,
yeah,
or
yeah.
what have you, right? so
So
so I
what was
think
that?
that's a first important part.
You all know that I spend a lot of time talking about themes like leadership and the future of work. But there needs to be a company out there that's actually powering the future of work. A company out there that's designing, building, and managing the systems that the world depends on. Without those types of companies, there is no future, and there is no future of work. And that's why today's episode is sponsored by Kyndryl. They're a technology services company that advances the vital systems the world depends on every single day. Kyndryl is the heart of progress. At Kyndryl, progress starts by standing up for something with intention, being pro something with your whole heart. And those of you who've been listening to my program know that I talk about being able to take a stance for something, being able to fight for something, and not just being passive and playing in the gray areas. So one of the things that I love about Kyndryl is they are pro something. Kyndryl stands up for progress by committing to help their customers digitally transform technology systems with a global team of curious and diverse minds. Again, both themes that I have talked about on this show quite a bit, because there's nothing better than taking a step forward together. You can learn more by going to Kyndryl.com. That's KYNDRYL.com. Yeah, so what was that structure? What team or department were you in? What seniority did you have? And then where was he and what was his seniority level at the time?
Yeah. So I wasn't very senior. I was not yet an executive in the company. And so I was sort of at that cusp where I was like reaching for it, right? I knew it was my next role was to become an exec. And was one reason it was so important for me to have a mentor sort of guiding me through that period of time. And so I was in a role where I was similar to what I just alluded to. I was leading an account. So I was leading a client relationship. I was sort of living and breathing there with my client all day, every day. And I had a team of people, but it was all in service of this one specific client and not a broader sort of leadership responsibility at that time across the company. And if I remember correctly, because he had a couple of different roles. He was leading like a large organization, right? Like one of our sort of one of our pillars, one of the lines of business, if you will. And so a very big job. So there was a lot of distance between us in terms of sort of, reporting levels and that type of thing, which also, it first made me feel a little bit intimidated and not quite sure how to act with him, which may be why I gave such a sort of lame answer when he asked what I wanted out of it. But
So this was a formal,
he
this was like a formal
yep,
mentee mentor. It wasn't kind of like, hey, can you
yeah.
coach me? It was an assigned relationship.
hmm
Okay.
It was. And I had lots of the others too, right? Over the years, I had, more than I can count of just other amazing people who would lend an ear or lend advice that I could tap into. And those are necessary as well.
Yeah.
And, the other thing I'll add about mentorship that I think is so important is it's not enough just to be a mentor. You really have to be a sponsor,
Mm.
especially for people who are at that sort of cusp, like I was just describing, where I was really trying to get to that next level, really trying to become an executive. And, that's always, to me, that's the hardest one. That first sort of executive job is, in my opinion, the hardest one to get. And it's often where we don't have enough pipeline of diverse candidates, right, leading into that sort of next executive role. And so for me, that was just, it was great to have both the formal and the informal. But what was more important maybe was the mix of the formal and informal, sort of behind closed doors, advocating for me and saying, she's ready, she can do this. And that is really invaluable.
Mm.
So,
What did that relationship look like? So for people who are listening and watching, whether they're the mentee or the mentor, can you explain a little bit about what that relationship looked like? So for example, did you meet once a week and go through like a specific set of questions? And if so, what were those questions? Did he jump in when you were struggling? Could you go to him anytime with anything? Like how did that relationship actually work for the mentee mentor?
yeah, and I'll expand it beyond just that one relationship, because I've had others, and I would say there's kind of a consistent theme, which is back to what I said. It was I really believe the mentee has to drive it, right? So if I had wanted a regular weekly call, I could have asked for that. I
Okay.
did not. But it was really, for me to kind of figure out what worked and where did I need help and when did I need help. And so I think everyone is a little bit different of what works for them. For me, that sort of regimented, gosh, now I have to prep for my weekly mentoring meeting. That wasn't as appealing to me as just sort of saying, okay, like I've hit this situation, right? Like real time, I'm in the moment. I've encountered, this difficult situation either internally or externally. Can you help me navigate it? Or can you recommend somebody who maybe's been through something similar that I could bounce some ideas off of? And for me, that was more effective. I think, again,
Mm.
though, that's where it's so important for each mentee to not assume that there's sort of one way to do the mentor mentee
Yeah, yeah,
relationship.
yeah.
And it's really customized, I think, to, again, I think mostly to the mentee of what do you want to get out of it, right? At the end of the day, that's
Yeah.
the question.
How much of it was you coming up with problems and him suggesting solutions versus you coming up with problems, suggesting the solutions, and then getting feedback on your ideas? Because I think sometimes people think that you go to the mentor with a problem and it's up to the mentor to solve the problem for you, right? I mean, because that's a
Yeah.
lot, you're right. They're
Yeah.
kind of, hey, I don't know how to do this. What do you think I should do? So, what, when
Yeah.
you had those situations, how did you go to your mentors?
Yeah. So, again, probably some mistakes I made early on was to go with that assumption, like, hey, this is the problem. Aren't you going to solve it for me? Or at least tell me how to solve it myself. And again, that's not how it works. And I would say, now that the shoe's on the other foot and I've been a mentor to a lot of people, um, I've sort of refined over the years what I ask of the mentees who I
Hmm.
have or who come to me, which is, bring me your ideas,
Yeah.
right? Like, don't come and sort of lay it at my feet. If you're dealing with a challenge or you're trying to figure out a next step, come and tell me what you're thinking about and tell me sort of how you are contemplating approaching it. And I can help you think through whether that's going to lead you down a path to an answer or if it's just going to keep you sort of spinning in place where you are, right? But
Yeah.
I think whether it is a mentor mentee or just sort of a hierarchical conversation, because I would say the same thing to people in my reporting structure. I want to help, but you can't just sort of come and lay it on my table and expect that I'm gonna sort of,
Yep.
take it on and and solve it.
Yeah.
It's really about just giving the right guidance and trying to help you solve it in the best way possible for you, which
Okay.
might look different than how it would look for me, right? So
Yep.
we're all different.
So I took a couple notes here that I thought would be really interesting. If you were to think of maybe the top three questions that as a mentee you should be asking your mentor, or five questions, whatever you recommend, what do you think those top 3 to 5 questions would be? Because I think we've already established that simply going to your mentor and saying, I have a problem, fix it for me, or expecting the mentor to drive the relationship is not the right approach. So the mentee needs to be active. So what sort of questions should you be asking, and what sort of issues or problems should you be going to your mentor with? I mean, is there anything that's off limits or not appropriate or not relevant, or is this just kind of there for any help that you need?
Yeah, I'll start with that piece. And look, I think it depends on the personal relationship between the mentor and the mentee, and maybe even the organizational culture to some extent. There are boundaries, right?
Yeah.
Like the mentor is not your therapist. While therapy can be extremely beneficial, I can attest to that. It is not the role of the mentor to sort of guide you through, like personal situations outside of work or even just interpersonal dynamics inside of work. if it is like, something that's not really relevant for a mentor kind of conversation, right? So now, if that interpersonal relationship is with your boss and it's problematic and it's keeping you as an employee from thriving, then fair game for a mentor conversation, right?
Yep.
I think that it is about kind of knowing where that line is, though, of not getting overly personal, but obviously still being able to talk through the things that are impacting your ability to be successful in your role and to help you really start to um, mature and grow and learn in a way that's going to catapult you kind of into those more senior executive roles as you go forward. So as for like the three questions, I think for me, I'm going to start the opposite, because as a mentor, one of the first questions I ask people is, what are you passionate about? What's that thing that makes you really excited? And we all know what it is if we just tune in, right? We all have tells. My tell is I talk faster and louder and I use my hands a lot more even than I am today. And it like we all know those things that like really get us excited. And I really ask my mentees to tune into that, because all too often I've had mentees come to me and say, like, I think I'm supposed to check this box next, right? I think this is like the next role I'm supposed to do. And that as a mentor is just like a horrible thing to hear, because I truly don't believe that there's one path that everyone takes that same path,
Yeah.
right? I think if you're not doing something you're passionate about, you're also not as likely to be successful at that. And so I think, are we going to love every single part of every job we ever have? No, and I'm not naive enough to think that's true, but I do think if you stay grounded in what you get excited about and how you want to be spending your time all day, every day, and the goals that you have as part of that, I think that always serves you well, right? And I know it has served me well in my career. And so, I think with that, you also get a level of authenticity. Like if you're staying true to yourself and staying true to the things you're passionate about, I think it just makes you more authentic as a teammate, as a boss, as just a human being. And I think that is how I want to show up to work every day, and I
Mm.
think it's how most of us want to. But I think that, given that, I think as a mentee, questions that are really fair to ask a mentor are, of course, first and foremost about their own personal experience and kind of what has guided them. And I think that can be useful just as a reference point, because again, we're not all the same, right? We haven't all had the same set of experiences. We don't all handle things the same way. And it can be really useful to get a different point of view about things. And, I know that, when I have these conversations about what makes you passionate, people are sort of surprised because they assume that that's not part of the formula of, what you're going to hear from your mentor about how to like make these steps in your career. And to be fair, they probably heard a different kind of set of questions or talking points from someone else, right? But so it's, for me, part of having a mentor is not just having one. You need a broader set of perspectives. And so I think, asking your mentor again about their experiences and what did they find that worked and didn't work for them, it's a helpful just sort of starting reference point,
Okay.
right?
I like that.
It doesn't mean you have to adopt it. It doesn't mean that it's necessarily going to apply to you, but I think it can be useful to start to kind of hear just those different points of view, right? And I think, from there, you can kind of get into a little bit more. Another question I have often asked is just, I'm about to do this thing that I've seen you do, right? So, for example, if I come into a new role and I'm going to build a team, and I want that team to act like a team, I might ask one of my mentors, okay, I've watched you do this. Where did you start? How did you start to think about the different sort of pieces of this puzzle? Because I'm the kind of person that, like, I need to see the whole puzzle, right, before I start just making individual moves. Because if you make individual moves, you can get a lot of fantastic individual contributors, but you might not get a team. You might not get
Yeah,
that
yeah, yeah.
whole, puzzle put together. And so that's one that I feel like you have a real not just a problem, but I mean that building a team is kind of a major piece of being a leader, right? And um, picking all the right parts, the organizing it the right way with the right roles, the right people in the roles. And so that's one where I have personally asked that question, like, okay, tell me your thought process. How did you go through this? How did you get to the other side? And are there things you would have done different now in hindsight, right?
Yeah.
As you look back. And that can be useful. And if you have a good mentor and they're willing to be really open and transparent with you, you'll probably learn that it didn't all go perfectly. And there is some, security in that, knowing that, like, it's okay if it doesn't go perfectly, because really almost nothing ever does,
Yeah.
right?
Yeah.
And I think that, I think as a mentee, that's an important aspect, because it's really tempting to kind of look up to a mentor and assume that everything is sort of perfect and
Yeah.
they got where they are by just everything executing
Sailing on clouds and
perfectly. And
rainbows and no issues.
exactly, never any issues, never any sort of things that they would change if they could do it again. And that's just not
Wow.
reality, right? We all have things that we learn from. And for me, that's one of the most helpful things, is really learning from someone else's experience, both the good and the bad, and what they would do the same and what they would do different. And
Okay.
even if I choose to take a different path, it's good input. And I think that's a really important part of this mentor-mentee relationship, is it's input. It's not instructions, right? It's not a manual that you go and you
Yeah,
kind of
that's a very
execute
important
against. It
distinction.
it is yeah, it definitely is, because you still have to be you at the end of it, right? And so it's about taking the inputs from your mentors and from your own instincts and intuition, and just learning and experience, and sort of triangulating all of that into the thing that feels most authentically you and feels like the right answer,
Yeah.
for what is in front of you, right? But because they weren't in front of the same exact problem that you were.
Yeah,
So
it's kind of like using ChatGPT, right? I mean, I think a lot of people use ChatGPT, they put in information, and whatever ChatGPT spits out, sometimes they think, okay, that's what I'm going to say. But you still have to take the
right.
information that you get from a platform like ChatGPT and make it yours and put your spin on it and evaluate if it makes sense or not and bring in other sources. So I think viewing your mentor as kind of like a chat GPT for career and leadership advice is similar, right? You have to know the
Yeah,
right questions to
I
ask.
like that.
And then when you ask the right questions, you'll get valuable outputs, but you still need to make sense of those outputs. All right. Because if you ask your mentor, what did you do? They give you advice, you do the exact same thing, and then you say, hey, it didn't work for me. What the hell? That was like the worst advice you've ever given me. You also need to take accountability of
Yeah.
you're not them, right? Different personality, different
Yes.
circumstance and
Exactly.
situation, different team. So I really like that approach of separating kind of the rules from I guess you could call it the rules from the message, maybe the rules from the
Yeah. Well, as a mentor, I always kind of give that disclaimer, right? That's kind of what it feels like it is.
yeah
A little bit of a disclaimer that says, like, this is what I did. It doesn't mean it's the right thing for you. But I think you can learn from it. I think you
mm,
can learn from my experience coupled with your own experience. You can then make an informed decision, but it still has to be your decision,
yeah
right? And I think That's another piece of the mentor-mentee relationship that you have to kind of be careful of as a mentee, is that you don't start using your mentor as a crutch.
Yep.
That, you kind of go to them and think, oh, I have to talk to my mentor, like something bad just happened, or I have a big decision to make, or they're not there to make all your decisions for you and think for you. They're there to help, sort of guide you and help you think through things differently and based on their own experience, as opposed to just sort of handing you, the answer on a
Yeah.
platter and you just go execute.
It's kind of like having a flashlight or something in the forest, but not having the path laid out from you. So the mentor is not going to put out the path for you to follow, but they'll give you the flashlight
Right.
so that you can walk around and
Yeah.
find things the right way and discover things. And I think that's an important thing to have.
Yeah.
Getting back to those three
Yeah.
questions, because it sounds like there was a lot
Yes.
there. So one, sort of the personal, what worked for you. You also mentioned a lot of other questions. I don't know if you would bucket them all under this or if those are all separate questions, right? So what worked for you in the past? What didn't? What was your
Mhm.
decision-making process like to get to that point? Any other questions that you think are useful for mentees to ask their mentors?
Yeah, well, I also think I think one of the things a lot of people struggle with as they sort of move up in their career is navigating sort of all of the political, I guess I'll call it, or
Yeah,
just other
pressure,
relationships, like
responsibility, office
pressure,
politics,
responsibility.
bureaucracy.
How do
Yeah.
you, yeah, exactly. And balancing between running a business and being a people leader. I hope every day that I find the right balance of integrating those two things, but it's they sometimes feel at odds, and you have to kind of look for ways to make them less at odds so that you can fulfill sort of both of your roles as a business leader and a people leader.
Mhm.
And I think those kinds of questions around just navigating certain situations and that finding that balance, when because as leaders we're all asked to be and do multiple things, right? You're never just sort of like single tracked.
Yeah.
And so I think as a mentee, those are certainly, similar questions that I've had, which is either based on a situation I was in as the mentee or something I observed from the mentor. But, just trying to understand, um, like, how do I navigate these different personalities? And, how do I come out of this having hopefully, you know, progressed my cause and not offended anyone or made any enemies along the way? That interpersonal dynamic is one that I know I get a lot of questions about
Yeah.
from mentees as
Yeah,
well.
no, those are great. I think some of the feedback and sort of the tactical and strategical aspects of being a good mentee is important. To your point earlier, a lot of people just assume it's the mentor carries it, but it's actually the mentee that
Right.
carries it. So let's shift that
Yeah.
now to the mentor, because a lot of people are also mentors. One of the questions that you mentioned is that you ask people what they're passionate about. So
Yeah.
a couple of things come to mind. So first, curious about the other questions. And then the other thing is, what do you do with the question when you get the response? So let's say you ask me, Jacob, what are you passionate about? And I say, well, I mean, let's say I'm passionate about chess, or I'm passionate about, I don't know, content or sharing ideas. What do you then, as a mentor, do with that information? Like, how do you turn it into something?
Yeah. Well, look, I started asking that question because I had so many people come to me. And of course, most people want to talk about career progression as a mentee. And, I would say, well, what do you like to do? Which was probably not the right way to phrase the question, right? Or what do you want to do? And so I've learned some as a mentor as well, because that question always elicits a response, or at least for me, historically, has elicited a response that was a job title,
Yeah. Yeah, yeah,
right?
exactly.
And and a job title. while directionally helpful, it's not really like going to lay out a path. So
Yeah,
I
I want to be
always
SVP.
try to encourage people. Yeah, exactly. And it's I always tell people titles can change, job roles can change, organizations can change, but I firmly believe what you're passionate about, while it can evolve, there's probably like a root in there that stays somewhat consistent, right? And you can learn and grow. I'm not saying you're one thing always and forever, but it to me, that is a better indicator of what someone really loves to do. Because otherwise, mentees, and I've done it myself, as I said, show up at a conversation with their mentor, and they talk in terms of, again, I think this is supposed to be my next role. Or I see all these other people that have been successful went through this one role. And maybe like sometimes there are certain roles that are good developmentally for you to make progress in your career, but to say that there's just one path and every single person goes through that same path,
Hmm.
not only is that not true, it would be really boring because then you would have just, a lot of people with the same exact path, the same exact set of experiences, and you wouldn't have people bringing a lot of diversity of thought to the conversation, right? And that wouldn't be good for your customers or your business. And so, for me personally, I think it's good that people take a variety of different paths. You may end up in the same place, but the different experiences that got you there are going to drastically, sort of differentiate your opinions from one another, and give you really good sort of, debating topics, as you think about, kind of what is it that I want to do next? And, I want people to think about that diversity of experience. I don't
Hmm.
want them to think they just have to follow like there's one defined path and that's it
Yeah,
forever.
yeah. So what other questions do you as a mentor ask? Obviously, you mentor a lot of people. Besides asking what they're
Yeah.
passionate about or interested in, what are some of the other questions you ask them?
Yeah. Well, look, I mean, that's a big one, and you'd be surprised how many people haven't thought of it. But so that one, especially in a first call or two, that one
Yeah.
tends to take up a lot of conversation. But look, I mean, going beyond that, then it really is, you know, trying to get to the heart of, again, in our relationship as mentor and mentee, are you looking for help for career progression? Are you looking for help in tackling real life problems that are happening today? Often, I find that people lean more towards sort of that career progression, or at least that's been my experience. They want to know, everybody kind of wants to know the magic formula for getting to the next level, or, what did I do? And what I do or what I did to get where I am is relevant, and it's an interesting part of the conversation, but it, again, that
Yeah.
sort of implies there's just one path to get there. So I just think that, once I really have a better understanding of them as a person and what they're passionate about, I really try to get them to think about like the roles they've had before that they loved. Hopefully, they've had roles they've loved, and the roles that they've had that they didn't love as much. And I actually encourage people, and I do it myself, to really kind of write these things down, like the things I've loved, and the things that are on my kind of never want to do it again list, and then that sort of group in the middle that, like, okay, I'm willing to negotiate on it if I have to. Um, and I go back to that list, and I'll be honest, it doesn't change that drastically anymore. It's kind of refined at this point for me. But I find that a lot of people just haven't taken the time to sit down and even kind of think in those terms. Um, and it's not that that says you can or cannot take a specific job. It's just good self awareness. I think, being self aware of our passions and our strengths and the things we want to do and don't want to do, it just helps us have a game plan
Mm.
for how we tackle whatever job we're in, right? And it doesn't shut you out from anything. And it doesn't necessarily mean you're the perfect fit for something either. It's just, I am a much more self aware person now than I was probably, at the beginning of my career, because I've, I've sat down and I've spent the time really thinking about this. And I didn't do that in the beginning, right? I just sort of put one foot in front of the other for a while, until I got to a point where I wanted to be more concerted about my steps and my career and the things that I wanted to do. And now that kind of grounds me, right? And I just did this exercise recently with my leadership team that's just directly reporting to me. And we sat down with help from a facilitator and kind of all talked about, what are those things for each of us? Like, what are those things that are our values, our passions, and how does that influence how you work with me, right? And we kind of
Mm.
each had to say, like, here's the things to watch out for when you're working with me, because these things, I really don't like to do these things, so they kind
Yeah.
of set me off if you ask me to do them. And I just think it's that self awareness. And, candidly, my team, I think they thought I was a little crazy when they found out this is what we were going to do for half a day. And they've told me that. So if they're listening, they absolutely are probably nodding their heads. Yes. They were like, oh, yeah, we've all done team building. Right. And this really wasn't as much about team building as it was the self awareness individually to be
No.
able to call out, the pluses and minuses, or I don't even want to call them pluses and minuses, but just the things that are important to me. Like, so for me, empathy, authenticity, those are always going to be at the top of my list. So that I can give learnings to someone who's trying to work with me to understand that if they come at a people problem from a very sort of dry, financial only kind of perspective, it's not, that conversation isn't going to go well, right? Like, we're going to be like on different pages. And so just finding those that self-awareness so that how you're going to act and react in certain situations, I have found to be incredibly valuable.
This episode is made possible by Kyndryl. They are a company that is designing, building, and managing the systems that the world depends on. There is no future of work without companies like Kyndryl that are out there making all of these things happen. Kyndryl is a technology services company that advances the vital systems that the world depends on every single day. They help their customers digitally transform with a global team of curious and diverse minds. You can learn more about them by going to Kyndryl.com. That's KYNDRYL.com. Honestly, I didn't even plan on having such a long conversation about mentorship and mentees, but I think this is so useful and valuable for people out there, both who are mentees and mentors, that I'm glad that we're spending all the time on this, because there's a lot that even I'm learning about this. A lot of the times people talk about mentee and mentorship relationships kind of high level, but you're actually giving some very tactical and specific guidance around how to make that relationship work, which I think is super useful for anybody inside of an organization. But a lot of what we've been talking about has been on maybe official relationships, right? So somebody says, hey, you have a mentor, now work on that relationship. What happens if you're at an organization that doesn't have that kind of an official mentorship program?
Yeah.
How do you navigate that? Like, do you go up to people and say, hey, can you be my mentor? Because that might also be a little bit off-putting. Like, how do you do that if that official structure is not in place?
Yeah, I would say I have been really pleasantly surprised that a lot of people, I would say, sort of not exactly new in their careers, but maybe less experienced in their careers, are more bold about that than I ever was. So I I would never have walked up to somebody and just said, like,
Can you be my
"Hey, would you
mentor?
be my mentor?" Like, um, uh, and maybe I should have, right? But I have had a lot of people reach out to me to the point that sometimes I have to like politely say, I'm tapped out. That's another
Yeah.
thing as a mentor. You can't take on everybody, but I have someone else that I think might be a good fit for you. So I mean, I completely encourage people to reach out if they want that. But again, you can't expect somebody to take on, 100 or 1,000 people, because then it's not good for you as a
Yep.
mentee either, quite frankly. But I do see people being more bold about that. I also see people in my organization, sometimes execs, sometimes not execs, that are building their own kind of set of mentees, right? And
Mhm.
bringing those mentees together. So I also think that, that's very empowering when someone says, I'm going to mentor that person, right?
Yeah.
Just
Yeah.
sort of in a very unofficial way, and reaches out to them and builds a community. And I hope she doesn't mind me saying it, but my previous chief of staff, she was great about this, and she's gone on to be an executive, and she has this group. She calls them her mints, and they, they speak with her one on one. They speak together as a group. They do things together. Like, it's created a sense
Yeah.
of community and learning, not only from her, but with each other. And they're all relatively new in their careers, and she's really helping guide them through that. And she really leans in. She was at a client recently, and the CIO was still there, like kind of late at night, and she introduced her to one of her mints. And the she was a little, I think, nervous, but that's like
Yeah.
taking that extra step, and just being, again, back to my earlier point, being more of an advocate, not just sort of a passive mentor. but
So you
but
got to
look,
ask.
I think
You got to ask, it sounds
yeah,
like.
go ahead.
And so let's say you do ask and I don't want to say get turned down, but the mentor does say no, or you can't, because I think that happens to a lot of people, right? Either they're scared to ask and be proactive, or maybe they ask and they can't do it. And then they think, well, now I'm alone. But it sounds like your advice is there are people inside of your organization who will be willing to mentor you. You just have to find them. And the way that you find them is
Yeah.
that you ask around. And probably the
Hmm.
way that you can find a good mentor is, I mean, I'm just going off of what I've heard, but you kind of look for qualities that you want to emulate. You look somebody who's in a position that you would maybe one day like to get into. You look at somebody who
Hmm.
maybe makes decisions that align with with values that you have. You also need to be pretty picky about who you ask to be your mentor, right? You don't want just because somebody's a VP and you're not, doesn't necessarily mean that they're going to make a good mentor to you. You also need to know who you're approaching and who you're asking there. So any advice or
Yeah.
guidance on that? And then I have maybe one or two more questions that
Mm.
just kind of popped into my mind as you were talking.
Yeah, sure. One of the things I have seen from my team lately that I think is great is, so part of being a relatively new company is we've spent a lot of time on culture. And part of that culture work has been around creating inclusion networks, right? We
Yeah.
call them our Kyndryl inclusion networks, KINs. And I have seen there's such a sense of community in these groups, in the inclusion networks. And I've seen a lot of mentor mentee relationships get their start there, because it is a
Organically.
place where very organically, because
Yeah.
there's events, there's opportunities to get together either in person
Employee
or
resource groups
virtual.
and stuff like
They're Yeah, they're exactly. They're led by senior people on my team. But the participants, it kind of flattens the organization. There's participants at all levels of the organization, and it creates more, I think, a sense of safety and comfort, where people do feel confident that they can ask and they won't be sort of chastised, or if they get a
that.
no, it won't be like an ugly no. It will be, a no, but let me help you find someone else, or have you talked to this person? And so, that I have seen a lot of that happening, which has been really encouraging to me, that those inclusion networks have created such safe spaces
Yeah.
that people are really willing to kind of take that chance and lean in a little bit and ask, somebody to be their mentor or
Yeah.
to help
Yeah.
them find one. And I think that's a good example versus sort of just maybe cold calling somebody, that you've never actually talked to.
Yeah, that approach probably doesn't make sense, but it's also a little bit of a tough love approach because essentially what I hear you saying is you can find them. You have resource groups, you have networks
Hmm.
in your company, you have people that you work with, you have leaders. Like you can find them. Just put in the time to find them, and don't just assume that a mentor is just going to
Yeah.
drop in your lap all of a sudden. How important is having, so let's say you have that relationship, right? How important is structure on it? And I know this is very tactical, but for example, do you agree to meet once a week? How many mentors should you have? How many mentees should you have? Any guidance on how, just tactically structure that?
Yeah. Well, I think how many mentees you should have is sort of governed by your time. How much time can you spend at it? And look, my team would tell you I would spend all my time doing that if I could, but I have a multi-billion-dollar business to run. So sadly, as much as I get so energized from those conversations and
Yeah.
would love that to be my whole calendar every day, I know I can't, right? So
Would you
I
say
do
it's like
have
a
to be
couple hours a week
selective.
for you, maybe like 2 hours a week or something?
Yeah, sometimes more. And if I'm traveling, maybe a little bit less. But if I'm traveling, I'm usually going somewhere where I am having some of those kind of one-on-one conversations with employees and other parts of the
Yeah.
organization and world as well. So sometimes it's just a one-time thing, right? It's a one-time conversation to maybe kind of get them down a path and then maybe get them, to find a more regular mentor that they can work with. But if it's somebody that I work with on a regular basis, again, I leave it to them. How
Yeah.
often do we talk? And what do you want to talk about? And I let them set the agenda, right?
Okay.
I might say a few words at the beginning to kind of just check in, see how things have been, but I really say, okay, the floor is yours, right? Like this is your time. You asked for it. If it's going to be productive, it's going to be because you make it
So
productive.
mentee drives kind of like, is it okay if we maybe
Yeah,
get together once a week? Maybe I can send you a couple
yeah,
emails. So you probably, as a mentee, if you're looking for a mentor, should have a sense of what exactly you're looking for, right? Because if you just go and hey, Amy, can you be my mentor? And you say yes,
yeah,
and then it's kind of like, okay, now what? I need to come to you and say, is it okay if maybe we just chat for 15, 20 minutes a week? Can I send you maybe some ideas by email every now and then? So having an idea of what you as a mentee want that relationship to look like is probably
yeah.
crucial. And then I guess as a mentor, you
It
can
is.
provide guidance on that. You can push back and say, well, I can't meet with you every week, but I can respond to emails and maybe some texts, and maybe once every other week we can spend an hour.
Yeah.
So you got to kind of work on that relationship together.
Absolutely, but the mentee definitely drives as far as I'm concerned, right? You've got to know what you want to get out of it. And look, it has happened to me where I've agreed to meet or mentor with someone, and they show up, and I kind of do a few niceties at the beginning and tell them a little about me. That's often the question number one. Tell me
Yeah.
about, a mentee will ask me, tell me about your path. And um, but then in this one particular case, I said, okay, the floor is yours. Like you asked for the time, so you guide us here. And I basically kind of got like a 5-minute commercial on this person, right? Here's everything I've done. These are the great things. These are my accomplishments. It's sort of like a CV speed dating session, if
And
you
then this
will.
doesn't help anybody, right?
And it doesn't help anybody because it wasn't actionable for me. And I even said that at the kind of end of the commercial. I said, well, what would you like to get out of this? And the response was, well, I just wanted you to know me and
So
who
keep
I
an eye on me for a
am.
promotion or
And
kind of something like that. Yeah.
yeah, exactly. And look, I mean, awareness and visibility is important. There's no question. But if you're gonna get time with a senior executive,
Yeah.
have a plan, have something that's actionable that you could sort of take away from it and work on yourself, or maybe you ask the mentor to work on it with you. But you have to. It has to be a little bit more engaging than sort of just like, here's who I am. I want you to know all about me, because
Totally agree.
I can read your CV.
Totally agree.
So
Yeah. I love that.
yeah.
Well, we have been talking for just over 50 minutes on this, which has been honestly, I think probably one of the most in-depth mentor-mentee conversations we've had, which is again, absolutely fantastic. Is there anything else that you want to wrap this conversation with on either the mentee or the mentor side that we didn't touch on? Any additional advice, exercises, anything that you want to make sure that we touch on before we wrap up?
Yeah, well, look, I mentioned this exercise I did with my team, and like, the things that are important to me are empathy and authenticity, right? And that's kind of, it's what I shared with them. It's what they already know about me because they see how I operate every day. But I think, look, both mentor and mentee, you kind of have to understand each other that way that I was explaining kind of with that exercise I did with my team. I'm always going to come at a place from empathy and authenticity, and as a result, I expect, maybe a strong word, but I hope that you as a mentee will do the same. And for me, authenticity is linked to something you talk a lot about, which is vulnerability, and like and just overall transparency and building trust, right? You mentioned
Yep.
building trust was earlier, but it's like those things to me are so just linked, right? Like, and I know, and I share this with every mentee I have. For me, the moment in my career that something kind of clicked, and it was probably a mix of personal and professional things that made the click happen. And I realized, like, I'm just going to show up as authentically me. Like, that was the moment that my career really started
Mm,
to accelerate. And, I share that with mentees because I think it's important. Like, I want people, not only do I want people to feel that they can show up as their whole selves every
yeah.
day, because that's incredibly important, but I want them to feel they can show up um, and just be authentic. Not, you don't have to be someone else. It's kind of like that same idea that there's this specific job that I'm supposed to go do next and check that box. I think sometimes I find in my mentor mentee relationships, people think they're supposed to act a certain way or say a certain thing, particularly in the confines of that relationship. And I would say, you know, uh, that doesn't always like get you to where you want to go,
Yeah.
right? Because if you're sort of just putting on a veneer and think, well, I'll say the right things, I'll say what I think I'm supposed to say to, my upline, or to my mentor, like, you're never probably going to get as much out of it as you could if you just sort of like tear down some of those walls
Mm.
and be authentic and really talk about what you want to do. Like, you don't have to say you want to go do that thing that you think you're supposed to want to go do to help you progress in your career. There are ways to have amazing careers and to progress to really senior levels without doing what you've watched someone else do. And I think, for me, that is kind of at the crux of any good mentor mentee relationship is, is there that kind of shared authenticity and not just sort of, having a mentee who holds back, or a mentor, quite frankly, who holds back. A mentor that acts like they never had any bumps in the road along the way in their career is really no different than a mentee who acts a certain way because they think they're supposed to, right? So
Yeah.
you kind of got to peel that back if you really want that relationship to be fruitful and to yield what it's supposed to, which is hopefully progressing somebody in their career and getting them to a place where they're, successfully doing something that they love doing and they have a passion about it.
And I
So
think it's a kind of a both people benefit, right? I mean, the mentee ideally progresses
yeah,
forward and the
yeah.
mentor knows that they're helping you. But obviously, if you're not
Hmm.
doing anything and you're not progressing as the mentee, then the mentor is kind of like, well, am I not a good mentor? Like, what's going on here? So the mentor also has an invested interest in
Yeah,
you succeeding and doing well too.
absolutely. Yeah, because honestly, it also, as a mentor, you think, would somebody else do better by this
Yeah,
person?
yeah,
Like,
yeah.
should I find someone else to mentor them? Would they be a better fit? Or is it just, sometimes maybe it's just not the right chemistry, and
Chemistry,
it's
yeah.
not a good match. That is a reality. Like, you have to be able to have a certain level of that, chemistry that comes with,
Yep.
wanting to have these deep conversations about, like, what kind of where you're going in your career. And if that connection just isn't there, sometimes it is better to move on, quite frankly.
Totally
So
agree. Amy, this has been an absolutely fascinating conversation. Where can people go to learn more about you and Kyndryl? Anything that you want to mention for people to check out?
yeah, sure. So first of all, Kyndryl is, it may not be intuitive, but Kyndryl is Kyndryl. And you can go to Kyndryl.com if you want to learn more about the company or me. I'm highlighted on the leadership page, or of course, you can find me on LinkedIn.
Very cool. Amy, thank you so much for taking time out of your day. I really appreciate it.
Yeah. Thank you, Jacob. This has been fantastic. I've loved the conversation. Hopefully, it comes across that this is a topic I'm really passionate about,
Oh, yes.
especially because it wasn't the topic we were going to talk about
No,
really
not
at
at
all.
all.
And we,
No. We were going to talk about like transformation and
yeah,
just some totally unrelated stuff, but this actually ended up being far better. So I'm really glad I kind of went down this path.
yeah,
So thank you
yeah. Me
again.
too.
Thank
Thank
you,
you.
everyone, for tuning in. My guest again, Amy Salcido, president of Kyndryl in the United States. I will see all of you next week. I hope you're enjoying this podcast. But if you're looking to step up your leadership game, if you're looking to go even further in your career, to create a future-ready organization, and to create a culture where employees genuinely want to show up to work each day, then head over to greatleadership.substack.com. This podcast is kind of like the appetizer, but greatleadership.substack.com is going to be your main course, your dessert, your coffee, and your tea. It's going to give you everything you need to become the leader that your people need and want. It'll teach you how to excel in your career. And best of all the things I'm going to share with you are based on actual CEO interviews, on data, on research, so you know that everything is backed up and it's credible. Again, head over to greatleadership.substack.com.